Usually when we talk about like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of total precision.
Right, yeah, like it's a math equation or something.
Exactly. It feels like engineering. Like
Yeah.
you break your arm, you go to the hospital and they do an x-ray and the screen just shows that jagged white line.
Right, it's right
Y-
there. You can literally just point at it.
Yeah, the doctor points at it and it's just binary. Broken or not broken, it's clean. And frankly, it's really comforting because we like things to be visible and, categorized. We want things to fit neatly into our modern frameworks.
We really do. I mean, we are so conditioned by the scientific method and modern journalism too, honestly. We just expect data to be presented to us in these literal, objective, easily quantifiable terms.
But then you step into the world of ancient history, specifically like ancient textual translation, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, totally useless. You are flying blind.
Right. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. And it brings up this really fascinating premise, which is, what if the way we read ancient military history is just fundamentally backwards?
Yeah.
Like, what if applying our modern journalistic standards, the kind of literalism we expect from, a newspaper article to ancient Bronze Age texts, what if that's like trying to read a poem using a math textbook?
That is such a good way to put it
Yeah,
because you're going to get an answer, but it's going to be the completely wrong answer.
exactly.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And that tension, that friction between our modern expectations and these ancient literary conventions, that's exactly the landscape we were walking into today.
So welcome back to the deep dive. We are talking directly to you, our favorite learner, because you're the person who doesn't just want the sensational headline, right?
Okay.
You want to actually understand the substance, the history beneath it all.
And you have brought us a truly formidable stack of sources today. I mean, this is heavy stuff.
Oh, it's massive. We are looking at an intersection of theology, archaeology, linguistics, and ancient Near Eastern history. We've got works by scholars like Paul Copan, Matthew Flanagan, Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen, and late Bronze Age specialist Richard Hess.
Right, and sitting right alongside those scholars in this stack, we have some very famous, very pointed critiques from secular figures, too.
Yeah, most notably Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens.
Which is where things get really intense.
I actually want to start right there with those critiques, because the mission for today's deep dive is to look at one of the most notoriously difficult, polarizing, and frankly uncomfortable topics in all of ancient literature.
The big question.
The big question, did the God of the Old Testament command the genocide of the Canaanites? And I mean, the modern secular critique does not pull any punches on this.
No, not at all. They go right for the jugular.
In The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins famously writes, and I'm quoting directly here so I don't get this wrong, he says, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser."
Wow. I mean, it is a incredibly powerful quote.
It's visceral.
It really is. And it perfectly encapsulates that modern visceral reaction to the book of Joshua. And Hitchens makes very similar arguments, framing the ancient Israelite campaigns as just straightforward, divinely sanctioned ethnic cleansing.
Now, before we go a single step further into this, I need to set some parameters for this deep dive. Like, I want to put a massive, flashing neon impartiality disclaimer right here at the front.
Very necessary.
If you are listening to this on your commute or, while you're folding laundry, hear this clearly. We are not taking sides today.
Right.
We are not here to endorse a religion. We aren't defending a theology. And we are absolutely not here to validate any specific political viewpoints, left-wing, right-wing, or otherwise.
Our mission is purely analytical. We are going to impartially unpack what the source material argues. That's it.
Just the text.
Just the text and the history. We're going to look at how these ancient texts were originally written, how they were read, and how they were understood in their own time by the people who actually produced them.
Right.
And then we'll contrast that with how modern critics interpret them today. So we are strictly reporting on the historical and linguistic ideas contained in the original source material you provided.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we are going to look at the late Bronze Age through the lens of a word as heavy and, politically charged as genocide, we have to establish the modern terms we are actually using to judge these ancient texts.
Yeah, we need a baseline. Otherwise, we're just talking past each other.
Exactly. So what is the baseline?
The sources establish this baseline by introducing what Copan and Flanagan call the crucial moral principle. It kind of functions as a premise 1 and premise 2 in their whole philosophical breakdown of the debate.
Okay, the crucial moral principle, what is it?
Well, the most interesting thing about it is that it's actually a shared piece of ground.
Wait, shared between who? Like Dawkins and the biblical scholars?
Yes. Actually, yes. Both the modern secular critics and the Christian scholars completely agree on this one fundamental reality.
Which is?
That the deliberate, merciless slaughter of innocent men, women, and children is a moral atrocity.
Well, yeah, I would certainly hope so. I mean, nobody in these sources is attempting to write a defense of slaughtering innocent people.
Right, exactly. Even within the text of the Hebrew Bible itself, if you look at books like Proverbs or Jeremiah, there are explicit, harsh condemnations of shedding innocent blood.
So the debate we're looking at isn't over whether slaughtering innocents is bad.
No, not at all. The debate is strictly interpretive. The question the critics ask is usually, is genocide acceptable if a deity orders it? But the actual question the scholars are posing against the critics is, does the biblical text, when properly translated and understood in its late Bronze Age context, does it actually describe a genocide?
Ah. Okay, so once you accept that shared moral ground, the disagreement stops being an ethical defense of violence.
Right.
It becomes a matter of textual interpretation. It's about ancient genre.
Exactly. Which brings us to the specific definition of the word genocide itself. Because, we tend to use it colloquially today to mean like a military conflict where a massive amount of people are killed.
Right, just large-scale violence.
But legally and historically, it is a highly specific, codified term. The sources point us directly to the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide.
Okay, the UN definition. How do they actually define it?
The 1948 Convention defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such.
As such.
Yes.
Those two little words seem like they're carrying the entire weight of the legal definition.
They really are. They're the defining feature of the crime.
Yeah.
As such means you are targeting a population specifically for who they are.
Because of their identity.
Right. It is based purely on immutable identity, genetics, race, ethnicity. It is entirely regardless of what they've actually done or how they behave or what they believe.
Right. Like if we look at the actual horrors of the 20th century, the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, these atrocities targeted people simply because they belonged to a specific group.
Exactly. A Jewish person in 1940s Germany couldn't save themselves by, changing their political views or swearing allegiance to a different state.
Because they were targeted for their ethnicity as such.
Precisely. So applying that UN definition to the ancient text, the immediate question is, does the Canaanite campaign led by Joshua fit that criteria?
Right. Was this an ethnic cleansing fueled by an ancient racial hostility toward an outgroup?
Well, according to the textual and historical evidence presented by the scholars, it completely fails to meet the criteria for ethnic cleansing.
Wait, really? It completely fails?
Yeah, because ethnic cleansing requires an ideology of racial superiority and xenophobia. But if you look at the demographic reality of ancient Israel, as described in their own foundational texts, they were incredibly ethnically mixed right from their inception.
Okay, give me some examples from the texts. Because the popular conception is definitely that the Israelites were this isolated, genetically exclusive tribe who just wanted to wipe out anyone who wasn't them.
Right, but the text says the opposite. The book of Exodus explicitly states that when the Israelites left Egypt, a, quote, mixed multitude went up with them.
A mixed multitude.
Yeah, it wasn't just ethnic descendants of Abraham. It was a conglomeration of various peoples who just joined the movement. And furthermore, look at the central revered figures in the biblical narrative.
Like who?
Well, Joseph, one of the patriarchs, married Asenath, who was an Egyptian woman. Moses, the ultimate lawgiver of Israel, he married a Cushite woman.
A Cushite woman? Where's that from?
That's from the region of modern-day Sudan or Ethiopia.
Oh, wow, okay.
And Boaz married Ruth, who was a Moabite. And Ruth doesn't just, join the community. She becomes the great-grandmother of King David.
Okay, so the royal bloodline of Israel's greatest king is explicitly mixed with Moabite ancestry. That doesn't exactly fit the profile of an ethnically xenophobic society bent on racial purity.
It defies it completely.
Right.
And beyond just the genealogy, the Old Testament legal codes are absolutely filled with commands regarding the treatment of foreigners.
Like legal protections.
Yes. Leviticus 19 famously commands, "The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. They were institutionally commanded to protect the outsider.
Okay, I hear that, but I have to push back here, because if you're listening, you might be thinking what I'm thinking.
Go for it.
If Israel was so ethnically diverse, and if their own laws explicitly commanded them to love the foreigner and protect the resident alien, why did they target the Canaanites?
That's the big question.
Right, because to a modern reader, seeing an army marching in to attack the inhabitants of Canaan, it still looks exactly like wiping out an outgroup. How do the sources justify this specific target if they are claiming it isn't based on ethnicity?
That is the pivotal question of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
Because if it isn't ethnic, what is it?
Right.
The scholars argue that the biblical text provides a really clear answer that completely undermines the ethnic motive. The targeting was not based on race or genetics. It was based on behavior.
Behavior.
Yes, and the definitive proof of this in the text is that the exceptions prove the rule.
What exceptions?
Sparing people who absolutely should have been killed if this were truly a genocide. The primary example is Rahab.
Okay, the story of Rahab and Jericho.
Exactly. She is a Canaanite woman living in the city of Jericho, sitting right in the crosshairs of the initial military invasion. But she recognizes the reality of Israel's God. She hides the Israelite scouts, and she changes her allegiance. And what happens to her? She isn't executed. She and her entire extended family are spared. She is fully incorporated into Israelite society, and just like Ruth, her name eventually ends up in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew.
Okay, let's think about the logic of that for a second. If the divine command was strict ethnic cleansing, meaning wiping out Canaanite DNA from the land, then sparing Rahab would be a total catastrophic failure of the mission.
It would be a direct violation of the command.
Yeah.
If the ban, the harem as it is called in Hebrew, was an absolute unconditional mandate to exterminate a race, preserving Rahab is treason.
Yeah.
But the text presents her survival not as a violation, but as the proper intended functioning of the rule. It welcomed exceptions for anyone who turned away from Canaanite practices.
And it wasn't just one individual woman, right? Because an isolated case could just be like a fluke of war. Someone took pity on her.
Oh, it definitely wasn't just individuals. We also see the Gibeonites. They were an entire group of Canaanites who used deception to secure a peace treaty with Joshua.
Oh, right. They dressed up in worn-out clothes and pretended to be from far away.
Yes, they pretended to be travelers from a distant land. And when the Israelites discovered the trick, they didn't slaughter them. The treaty, even though it was obtained under false pretenses, it was honored.
Wow.
The Gibeonites were spared and permanently incorporated into Israel as servants of the tabernacle.
Wow.
Old Testament scholar Christopher G.H. Wright describes this shift perfectly. He says they moved from the hit list to the home list.
From the hit list to the home list. That's a great phrase. Okay, so if the Canaanites weren't being targeted for their ethnicity as such, and if they could be spared simply by changing their allegiance and their behavior, what exactly was the behavior that triggered this ancient military campaign?
Yeah, that's the thing.
Because if we are throwing out the ethnic cleansing motive, there has to be a massive why behind the warfare. What were they doing?
To understand the why, we really have to look at the cultural and historical context of the late Bronze Age Levant. And honestly, the archaeological and textual sources do not sugarcoat this.
It gets pretty dark. Right?
Very dark. The campaign was targeted at a society deeply entrenched in extreme institutionalized moral corruption. This wasn't a matter of the Israelites thinking the Canaanites just had, like, the wrong theological opinions.
Right. This wasn't two groups of theologians debating liturgy and getting violent about it.
No, not at all.
So what does the archaeology actually tell us about Canaanite culture?
It paints a genuinely horrifying picture. The scholars heavily reference the work of William F. Albright, who was a foundational 20th century archaeologist. In 1928, a farmer in modern-day Syria literally just hit a tomb with his plow.
Oh, wow. Just accidentally.
Just accidentally. And that led to the excavation of the ancient city of Ugarit at a site called Ras Shamra. Albright and others worked on translating the Ugaritic texts found there.
Okay, and what were these texts? Were they like historical records, text documents?
No. They were pre-Christian, non-Israelite, mythological, and religious texts that predated the conquest. They essentially served as the theological blueprint for the Canaanite pantheon. They detailed the practices and the character of the gods the Canaanites worshipped.
And what did that blueprint look like?
It was characterized by profound cosmic violence and sexual degradation.
Like what? Give me an example.
Yeah. For example, Albright translated texts detailing the exploits of the Canaanite goddess Inaneth. In her mythological narratives, she goes on massacres where she wades knee-deep and then neck-deep in human blood.
Neck deep.
Yes. The texts describe her decorating herself with severed heads and severed hands, washing herself in human gore in a state of what the Ugaritic texts actually call sensuous delight.
Okay. Wow. That is incredibly visceral. That's not just a god of war. That's a deity reveling in sadistic butchery.
It is. And this matters profoundly because of a deeply established principle in human anthropology, which is also highlighted throughout the biblical text. The principle is that worshipers inevitably come to resemble what they worship.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. The deities of the Canaanite pantheon, Baal, El, Anath, Asherah, they engaged in cosmic violence, ritual incest, bestiality, and institutionalized adultery. And we see those exact behaviors mirrored and codified in the society's actual practices.
Which brings us to the archaeological evidence of child sacrifice. The sources mention the Phoenician Punic practices. How does that connect to the Canaanites?
Well, the Phoenicians were essentially the cultural and geographical successors to the Canaanites. They continued their religious practices, and excavations at Phoenician colonies, most famously at Carthage in North Africa, have extensively documented the practice of infant sacrifice.
How extensive?
Very. Archaeologists have found massive cemeteries, which they call tophets, filled with the urns of cremated infants.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And the biblical texts frequently prohibit the Israelites from doing this. They tell them not to, quote, pass their children through the fire to Molech.
And for a long time, secular critics assumed that the biblical authors were just making that up, right? Like it was just ancient war propaganda to make the enemy look like monsters.
They did. They thought it was exaggerated. But the archaeology of the 20th century confirmed that it was a real, observed, and institutionalized practice. And we have to understand why they were doing it. This was all tied into their agricultural system. It was a fertility religion framework.
Okay, wait. Explain how that works. How does child sacrifice or, temple prostitution connect to agriculture?
Okay, so in the Canaanite worldview, human survival depended on the fertility god Baal sending rain to water the earth. But Baal was cyclical. They believed he would die and go to the underworld bringing the dry season, and he needed to be revived.
Okay.
And the Canaanites believed in sympathetic magic.
Sympathetic magic, meaning what?
Meaning the idea that performing an act on earth would stimulate the gods to perform the corresponding act in the heavens.
Oh, I see. So they believe their actions literally controlled the weather.
Exactly. So, to stimulate the gods to procreate and send the quote-unquote seed of rain, the Canaanites engaged in publicly funded, religiously sanctioned sexual rituals at their temples, which were known as the high places.
Wow.
This included institutionalized temple prostitution, both male and female, and ritual orgies. It was a literal reproductive economy.
And the children?
When the crises were severe, like during a major famine or a military siege, they would offer their most valuable possession, their firstborn children, to appease the gods and restore order.
Okay, when I hear you describe this, it totally shifts my mental model of what is happening in the text.
How so?
Well, I'm no longer picturing a standard war over national borders, where two armies are clashing over who gets to tax a trade route.
Right.
When you describe an entire society built around institutionalized abuse, temple prostitution, and child sacrifice, it sounds much more like a modern government trying to dismantle a deeply entrenched violent crime syndicate. Or taking down a massive, systematic human trafficking ring. If a military force is sent in to destroy a violent cartel that is hurting people on an institutional level, we don't call that genocide. We call it dismantling a corrupt infrastructure.
The cartel analogy is actually incredibly apt. The biblical text frames the campaign entirely as an intervention against the infrastructure of systemic corruption. And it's important to note how the scholars bring C.S. Lewis into this argument, specifically his book, The Abolition of Man.
How does C.S. Lewis fit into ancient Canaan?
So in The Abolition of Man, Lewis documents what he calls the Tao. And the Tao is the concept that basic moral codes-like prohibitions against murder, theft, betraying your family, are universally shared across many different human cultures and eras.
There is a universal moral convergence.
Exactly. The Apostle Paul actually refers to this as the law written on the heart.
So you're saying the Canaanites weren't just like innocent people who simply didn't know any better?
Right. The Canaanite moral failure was not a state of invincible ignorance. They had access to the baseline moral knowledge of humanity. But they engaged in a settled, institutionalized rejection of it. They knew what they were doing, and they deliberately built their society's infrastructure around the violation of basic human ethics.
Okay. I track with the cartel analogy, and I understand that the culture was profoundly corrupt. We've established the why, but we still have to deal with the actual text.
Yes, we do.
Because when you open the book of Joshua and read it in English today, you hit these terrifying verses. The language says things like, Joshua utterly destroyed all who breathed and left no survivor.
Yeah, the language is extreme.
Right. I can understand dismantling a cartel, but if they weren't committing a genocide, why does the text sound exactly like they're exterminating every living thing?
And this is where we have to transition from theology to ancient linguistics. To understand the how of this campaign, we have to deeply understand the language of ancient Near Eastern warfare. The sources point us to the extensive work of Egyptologist Kenneth Kitchen and the scholar K. Lawson Younger, Jr.
What did they find?
They have documented a consistent, widespread pattern of hyperbolic warfare rhetoric across the entire ancient Near East during the late Bronze and early Iron Ages.
Hyperbolic. So, like, exaggeration. Are you saying the Bible is exaggerating?
I'm saying it's using extreme, formulaic rhetorical bravado. Claiming total destruction of the enemy was the standard literary convention for a victorious king in that era. It was a recognized, expected genre of writing.
Oh, I see.
It was absolutely not meant to be read as a literal demographic report or an exact body count.
Okay, I need some hard examples of this from outside the Bible, because if it's just biblical scholars saying, oh, they didn't really mean it, that sounds like convenient backpedaling.
Sure.
If everybody else in the ancient world is writing like this, that changes how we read Joshua.
The cross-cultural examples are massive and, frankly, undeniable. Let's look at Pharaoh Thutmose III in the 15th century BC. He was one of Egypt's greatest military commanders. Okay. On his monuments, he boasts about his campaign against the Mitanni Empire. He inscribed that, quote, "The numerous army of Mitanni was overthrown within the hour, annihilated totally, like those now not existent."
Annihilated totally. That sounds pretty final.
It sounds definitive.
Yeah.
Except the historical and archaeological record shows clearly that the Mitanni army survived the battle and continued to fight the Egyptians for another century.
Wow, really?
Yeah, Thutmose didn't annihilate them totally, he just won a major battle.
What about other empires? Did they do this too?
Oh, everywhere. Let's look at the Hittite king Mursili II, ruling around the 1300s BC. In his official annals, he records a campaign where he claims he made entire mountain ranges empty of humanity.
I'm guessing he didn't actually do that.
Obviously not. He did not systematically scour hundreds of miles of mountains and kill every single human being. And then you have Ramses II, perhaps the most famous pharaoh, Ramses the Great.
Yes! Look at his famous bulletin describing the Battle of Kadesh, which took place around 1274 BC against the Hittites under King Muwatalli II. This was arguably the largest chariot battle in human history. And Ramses actually got ambushed. His forces were scattered, and he barely escaped with his life.
Wait, historically, Kadesh was a stalemate, right?
At best, it was a strategic draw, and Ramses actually lost territory in the aftermath. But what does Ramses do?
I'm guessing he spins it.
Big time. He goes back home to Egypt, commissions massive reliefs at the Ramesseum in Karnak, and carves into the stone that he personally, all by himself, slew the entire force of the Hittites and all the chiefs of all the countries. He dismisses millions of foreign soldiers as chaff that he scattered to the wind.
So it's pure ancient propaganda. The king has to look omnipotent.
Exactly. And we see it closer to Israel, too. There's an artifact called the Moabite stone, or the Mesha stele, discovered in 1868. It dates to around 840 BC.
On this basalt stone, King Mesha of Moab is mocking the Israelites using the exact same literary conventions he inscribes. Israel has utterly perished forever.
Wait, a Moabite king carved into stone that Israel perished forever in 840 BC.
Yeah.
Israel obviously didn't perish forever. They were a functioning kingdom for centuries after that.
Precisely. Kenneth Kitchen observes a profound irony here. This specific language of total annihilation has misled many modern readers.
How so?
Well, a modern critic reads Joshua, sees utterly destroyed, looks at the archaeology showing Canaanites still live there, and concludes the Bible is just a book of lies. But Kitchen reverses that logic entirely. He says the language of total destruction isn't a lie. It is conventional ancient rhetoric.
The ancient readers knew it was hyperbole, just like the ancient Moabites knew Mesha didn't actually wipe out Israel.
Exactly.
You know, if I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, okay, maybe ancient people talk like that, but it's hard for my modern brain to process. But actually, we do this exact same thing today. Think about modern sports commentary. Imagine you turn on ESPN and the commentator says, the Lakers completely crushed the Celtics last night. They annihilated them. They destroyed them on the court. They wiped the floor with them and left no survivors.
Nobody calls the police.
Nobody watching that broadcast calls the police. Nobody thinks the losing team was physically murdered. We all intuitively understand that the players boarded their plane and went home to their families.
Right.
The ancient reader had that exact same linguistic competence when reading the Book of Joshua. They knew how to read the genre of ancient warfare reporting.
The sports analogy perfectly captures the linguistic dynamic. We use absolute terms to describe decisive victories all the time without intending literalism. And the absolute most compelling proof that the Book of Joshua is using this hyperbolic convention is found inside the text of Joshua itself.
Wait, inside the text?
Yes. The author literally contradicts a literal reading of his own sweeping statements, sometimes in the very same breath.
Show me how the text does that.
The scholars highlight a fascinating grammatical construction they call the Joshua 10.1 self-qualification. It's an incredible piece of ancient syntax.
Okay.
The Hebrew text states that Joshua and the sons of Israel struck their enemies with a very great slaughter until they were finished, and the survivors who survived from them entered into the fortified cities.
Wait, let me make sure I caught that. It says, until they were finished and the survivors fled.
Yes, in a single continuous sentence. It syntactically pairs total annihilation with a fleeing remnant.
If I handed that into a modern high school English teacher, they'd fail me for a logical contradiction.
But it isn't an editorial mistake by a scribe who wasn't paying attention. It is a deliberate, highly sophisticated genre marker.
Signaling what?
It signals to the ancient reader that the phrase "until they were finished" is rhetorical bravado, meaning the victory was decisive and overwhelming. But narratively, the reality on the ground was that the surviving combatants retreated to their forts.
Oh, that's wild. It's the ancient equivalent of saying, we wiped them off the map. Anyway, they retreated into the bunker.
Precisely. And this pattern of hyperbole, followed by literal qualification, repeats constantly throughout the book.
Really? Where else?
Well, in Joshua 10, the text says Joshua left no survivor and destroyed everything that breathed in the hill country. But turn a few pages to chapter 15, and the text provides extensive lists of Canaanite groups still living and thriving in those exact same hill country areas.
Oh, wow.
In Joshua 11, it says Joshua took the whole land. But chapter 13 opens with God explicitly telling Joshua, "You are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land remains to be possessed."
And if you zoom out even further, the very next book in the biblical canon is the Book of Judges.
Yeah.
And what is the Book of Judges about? It's an entire narrative about the Israelites living right alongside all the Canaanite groups who are still there. If Joshua literally killed every single Canaanite, the entire Book of Judges would make zero historical or narrative sense.
Exactly. The text knows it is using hyperbole. The ancient writer and the ancient audience completely understood that the totality language existed on a rhetorical register to glorify the victory, while the narrative reality on the ground was something else entirely.
Okay, if we accept this linguistic framework, that they were using conventional boasting about defeating the enemy and not literally exterminating civilian populations, that creates a massive testable claim about what actually happened on the ground.
It sure does.
Who were they actually fighting?
To understand the reality on the ground, we have to look closely at the specific Hebrew verbs the text uses to describe the divine command. And we have to deeply examine the archaeology of what a Canaanite city actually was in the late Bronze Age.
Let's start with the verbs. If they weren't commanded to commit genocide, what were they actually commanded to do?
The sources emphasize that the most frequent verbs used in the Torah, like in Exodus and Deuteronomy, for what Israel was supposed to do to the Canaanites, they are not words for killing or slaughtering.
What are they?
The primary Hebrew verbs are yirash and garash.
And what do those translate to?
They mean to drive out, to dispossess, or to expel. The divine plan outlined in the text was a gradual expulsion and dispossession of the land, not a sudden bloodthirsty annihilation.
Driving out. Where else do we see those specific verbs used in the Hebrew Bible?
It's the exact same vocabulary used for displacement. So Adam and Eve were driven out, garage of the Garden of Eden. They weren't executed on the spot. They were relocated.
Right.
Later in the narrative, David was driven out from the kingdom by King Saul. He wasn't killed. He was forced to flee into the wilderness. The vocabulary inherently distinguishes geographic displacement from physical slaughter.
But don't English translations sometimes use heavier words?
Yes, even when English translations use heavier verbs like destroy, In the Hebrew context, it often refers to national or institutional destruction.
Like ending a nation's sovereignty.
Exactly. Ending a nation-state's sovereignty, not exterminating its people. And we know this because God later threatens Israel with the exact same destroy verbs. And the result wasn't extermination. It was the Babylonian exile. They lost their national sovereignty and were removed from the land.
So how did this driving out strategy actually work in ancient late Bronze Age warfare? Because practically speaking, I'm trying to picture it.
The prophet Jeremiah, writing centuries later in chapter 4, actually describes the standard ancient playbook for how this worked.
What does he say?
He notes that when a foreign army approaches a region, the non-combatant civilian population, the farmers, the shepherds, the families, they don't just stand in their fields waiting to be attacked. They flee. Jeremiah says, at the sound of the horsemen and bowmen, every city flees. They go into the thickets and climb among the rocks.
Right. Common sense dictates the civilians scatter into the surrounding countryside or hide in the mountains.
And an approaching ancient army, which operates on very limited rations and tight schedules, did not waste precious time and resources hunting down fleeing peasant farmers in the hills. They were there for a strategic purpose, to take the military stronghold.
So the civilians who fled the advance were successfully dispossessed or driven out. Only the military combatants who chose to stay behind and hold the fortified positions would actually engage in combat and be killed.
Precisely. Which brings us to the forts.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because when I read the English word city in the Bible, when I hear about the city of Jericho or the city of my 21st century brain immediately pictures a sprawling metropolis.
Of course.
I picture ancient New York or Rome, filled with thousands of civilian homes, bustling markets, women, children, and elderly people living inside these massive walls.
And according to the archaeological consensus, that is a massive historical misconception. The scholars rely heavily here on the work of Richard Hess, who specializes in the history and language of the Late Bronze Age. He points out that the Hebrew word translated into English as city is air. But in the specific context of 14th and 13th century BC Canaan, an air was not a civilian population center.
What was it?
It was a fortified military administrative citadel.
A citadel, so basically a military outpost.
Exactly. And we have incredible external confirmation of this from the Amarna letters.
I've heard of the Amarna letters, but explain what they are and why they matter here.
The Amarna letters are one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. In 1887, an Egyptian peasant woman was digging in the ruined city of Amarna and found a cache of clay tablets.
Just found them.
Yeah. They were written in Akkadian cuneiform, which was the diplomatic language of the day, and they turned out to be the actual diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BC between the pharaohs of Egypt, primarily Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, and the local Canaanite rulers who were their vassals.
Wow. So it's essentially reading the ancient emails of the Canaanite king.
Precisely. And in these frantic letters, kings from places like Jerusalem, Shechem, and Megiddo are begging the pharaoh for military backup against groups of raiders. But what the letters reveal about the structure of Canaan is fascinating.
What do they reveal?
The king of Jerusalem wasn't a mayor presiding over a bustling civilian metropolis. He was essentially a warlord or a military commander garrisoned in a fort.
Oh, I see.
These citadels existed to protect the local leadership, guard the trade routes, and house the religious infrastructure, the temples. The actual civilian peasant populations lived in undefended hamlets and farming communities scattered across the surrounding countryside.
So in the book of Joshua says the Israelites marched on the city of Jericho. They aren't marching on a sprawling civilian city.
No.
What was the actual physical reality of Jericho?
According to Hess's analysis of the archaeological footprint, Jericho was likely a tiny fort containing maybe 100 soldiers.
Wait, 100 soldiers, that's it?
That's it. It covered an area of just a few acres. It was a small outpost guarding the ford of the Jordan River.
Wow.
And when you realize that, one of the most famous, almost mythological details in the biblical text suddenly makes perfect logistical sense.
Are you talking about the marching around the walls?
Yes. The text says that on the seventh day, the Israelite army marched around the entire city of Jericho 7 times in a single day, and then still had the time, daylight, and physical stamina to fight a battle.
Right.
If Jericho was a massive, sprawling urban center like the city of Nineveh later in history, marching around it 7 times in a day would be physically impossible. You'd be walking a marathon in heavy armor.
But if it's a small military citadel covering just a few acres...
It's completely doable. You're just doing laps around a small fort.
That is mind-blowing.
Right. And the specific archaeology of Jericho's ruins confirms this structure perfectly. The Italian-Palestinian archaeological mission at Tel es Sultan, which is the mound of ancient Jericho, was led by an archaeologist named Lorenzo Negro. He documented the specific type of defensive walls used there.
What kind of walls were they?
In the Bronze Age Levant, massive urban hubs would construct what are called cyclopean walls, huge solid stone defensive structures. But Jericho had casemate walls.
What's the difference? What is a casemate wall?
A casemate wall consists of two parallel, thinner walls with empty space or partitioned rooms built right between them. They are typical of smaller fortified outposts because they are cheaper to build, and you can use the space inside the walls for military storage or as business space for traders, merchants, and tavern keepers.
Wait, tavern keepers living inside the wall? That perfectly matches the story of Rahab.
It aligns flawlessly. The text in Joshua 2 specifically notes that Rahab's house was on the wall or built into the wall.
I always thought that was just a weird translation.
For centuries, critics thought it was a strange, made-up detail. But this architectural reality perfectly fits the casemate wall configuration of a late Bronze Age military outpost. Hess points out that Rahab wasn't necessarily just a prostitute as traditionally translated, but likely an innkeeper running a hostel or tavern for travelers and caravans right there in the wall rooms.
And tavern keepers and their families would be the exact kind of non-combatants you would expect to find living in the physical structure of a military fort just to service the soldiers and passing merchants.
Exactly.
And as we discussed earlier, she and her family were the ones spared.
Right.
But I have to push back here because this is where the modern mind gets stuck. Even if it was a fort, the text explicitly says they killed men and women, young and old.
Yeah, the stock phrase.
Doesn't that definitively prove that civilian women and children were trapped inside that fort and slaughtered?
It's the most common and fair pushback from critics.
Yeah.
But Hess and the linguists clarify that men and women, young and old, is a well-documented, stereotypical ancient Near Eastern idiom. It is formulaic.
What does that mean in practical terms?
Think of our modern idiom. We wiped out everyone and his brother. If someone says that, you don't literally assume they investigated the family tree of the victims to ensure siblings were killed.
Right.
It's a phrase used to convey the totality of a category. In the ancient Near East, men and women, young and old, was a stock phrase meaning everybody who was there. It did not mean you literally took a census of the ages and genders of the corpses.
Oh, I see.
It meant the complete destruction of all the combatants who were stationed within the fort. As Hess concludes in his research, the text does not require that women and children must have actually been present in these military citadels for the author to use that standard formulaic phrase. The language just expresses the totality of the military victory over the stronghold.
Okay, so if we take all this evidence together, the hyperbolic trash talk language of the era, the strategic focus on driving people out rather than hunting them down, and the archaeological reality that these cities were actually small military citadels, this totally reframes the moral picture.
It really does.
It transforms the narrative from a bloodthirsty sweep through civilian neighborhoods into a limited, targeted military campaign against the corrupt strongholds of the ruling class.
Exactly. The charge of genocide, as defined by the UN, completely collapses when you apply historical definitions and ancient linguistics.
But that still leaves a massive philosophical question. Let's say it's not genocide. It's still a divine command for warfare.
True.
Why there? Why did God order this military campaign for this specific piece of real estate at this specific time in human history?
To understand the why there, we have to move into the theology of the biblical text itself. We have to look at the salvation historical context.
Okay, what does that mean?
The scholars, specifically Old Testament theologian John Walton, explain this through the concept of sacred space.
Sacred space, like the inside of a temple or a church.
On a macro level, yes. The biblical text presents the land of Canaan not just as arbitrary real estate or a random geopolitical prize. It is framed as a terrestrial extension of the Edenic motif. The land itself is sacred space.
What are the rules for that?
Well, the primary rule of sacred space in biblical theology is that dwelling in the presence of God requires moral correspondence.
Meaning you have to act in a way that reflects God's character if you want to live in God's space.
Right. It cannot tolerate institutionalized corruption. And this connects all the way back to the grand, overarching, redemptive trajectory of the Bible.
How so?
In Genesis 12, God makes a foundational covenant with Abraham. And what is the stated purpose of that covenant? God says, through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed.
So the ultimate goal was universal. It wasn't just about making one tribe happy, it was about saving everyone.
Always. The covenant was fundamentally outsider-oriented from the very start. But for that redemptive trajectory to survive history and reach its ultimate fulfillment, which Christians believe culminates centuries later in the arrival of the Messiah, Israel had to be preserved as a distinct, holy people.
They had to be protected.
Yes, they had to be protected from the extreme religious and moral corruption of the Canaanite culture we discussed earlier, the fertility cults, the child sacrifice.
Because if the Israelites just move in, assimilate, and start participating in temple prostitution and child sacrifice,
Then the redemptive plan fails entirely. The nation meant to be a light to the world dissolves into the surrounding darkness.
wow.
So the text presents the conquest not as an arbitrary, greedy land grab, but as a severe, unrepeatable judgment designed to cleanse sacred space, ensuring the redemptive trajectory of human history could continue.
I see the logic, but it's still so easy for critics like Hitchens to say this is just classic triumphalist propaganda. You know, every ancient empire claimed their gods gave them the land. Our God likes us and he hates you, so we get your farms. How is this any different?
But this is where the biblical text is entirely unique compared to every other ancient Near Eastern conquest account. If the book of Joshua were just triumphalist propaganda, the Israelites would be portrayed as spotless, inherent heroes who were racially superior to the Canaanites.
Right.
But they weren't. And the text introduces what the scholars call the boomerang effect.
The boomerang effect. I think I see where this is going based on what we said earlier about the destroy verb.
You probably do. The most striking proof that this wasn't a piece of racist, genocidal propaganda is that Israel eventually got the exact same treatment as the Canaanites. The standard of sacred space was terrifyingly objective.
How does that play out in the text?
It starts immediately during the conquest itself, in the book of Joshua, with the story of a man named Achan.
What happens with Achan?
During the Battle of Jericho, Achan disobeys the ban. He takes devoted plunder from the Canaanite religious site and hides it in his tent. In doing so, the text says he brings trouble upon Israel. And what happens? He is judged and executed in the exact same manner as the Canaanites.
Wow.
That text is making a profound theological point. An Israelite who acts like a Canaanite is treated like a Canaanite.
It's not about his DNA, it's about his actions of violating the space.
Exactly. And as history progresses over the centuries into the books of Kings and Chronicles, what happens to the nation of Israel as a whole?
They completely fail.
They do. They adopt the Canaanite practices, they set up the idols, they engage in the fertility cults on the high places. Kings like Manasseh even start participating in child sacrifice, burning their own sons.
And God's reaction is the boomerang.
Yes, God subjects Israel to the exact same moral standard. He uses foreign empires, the Assyrians and later the Babylonians, to drive out the Israelites from the land. The magnificent temple is burned to the ground. They are sent into exile in Babylon.
The Babylonian destruction.
Right. The Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC applied the exact same logic of sacred space judgment to Israel that Joshua had applied to the Canaanites centuries earlier.
So the text fundamentally does not argue that Israelites are inherently righteous and Canaanites are inherently wicked. It argues that moral corruption eventually faces divine judgment, completely regardless of your ethnic identity.
Yeah.
If Israel acts like Canaan, Israel gets expelled like Canaan.
Precisely. It is a terrifyingly objective moral standard, not ethnic favoritism. And within that strict standard, it's also crucial to note the staggering level of God's patience described in the narrative.
Patience. We're talking about ancient warfare and exile. Where is the patience?
We have to look back at Genesis 15 link scene. Centuries before Joshua was even born, God is speaking to Abraham. And God tells Abraham that his descendants will be enslaved in Egypt for over 400 years before they can inherit the land of Canaan.
Why?
The reason given is profound. The text says, "For the sin of the Amorite has not yet reached its limit," the Amorites being a primary Canaanite group.
Wait, so God delayed the promise to Abraham for 4 centuries?
Yes. God literally waited 430 years, giving the Canaanite culture more than 4 centuries to reverse its trajectory of institutional corruption before finally acting in judgment.
He completely exhausted the timeline of mercy before authorizing the conquest.
Exactly. It wasn't a sudden, capricious fit of rage.
Okay, the textual, linguistic, and theological arguments are incredibly layered, and frankly, they make a lot of sense of a very difficult text. But if we accept this, that they fought battles against citadels and drove the populations out, that creates physical evidence. Let's look at the archaeology.
Let's do it.
Because a huge pushback from critics is that the conquest of Canaan simply never happened. They look at the dirt and say, there is no evidence of Joshua's wars.
This brings us to a massive scholarly debate regarding chronology, the dating of the Exodus and the conquest. And the critics are actually partially right.
Wait, really?
Yeah. If you look for evidence of massive, all-consuming destruction in the 15th century BC, which is the date some traditional literalist chronologies use based on a face value reading of 1466, you simply don't find it. The major Canaanite cities were not burned to ash in the 1400s BC.
So how did the scholars resolve that lack of evidence?
By matching the textual clues to the actual dirt, the sources highlight the work of Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer. Hoffmeyer points out a crucial geographical detail in Exodus 1.11, which mentions that Hebrew slave labor was used to build the Egyptian store city of Pi-Ramesses.
Okay, why does Pi-Ramesses matter?
Because historically and archaeologically, the city of Pi-Ramesses was built by Pharaoh Ramses II around 1300 BC.
Oh.
It didn't exist in the 15th century. So if the Israelites built it, the Exodus had to happen later. If we shift our focus to the 13th century BC, the Ramesside period, the archaeological evidence suddenly snaps into focus and aligns beautifully with the text.
Okay, if they look at the 13th century, what does the evidence look like? Are there massive ash layers everywhere?
No, and that's the brilliant part. It looks exactly like what the biblical text actually claims happened.
Meaning what?
Remember, the text of Joshua and Judges does not claim an all-consuming total destruction where Israel burned every city to the ground. In fact, Joshua 11.13 explicitly states that Israel did not burn the cities standing on their mounds except for 3 specific citadels: Jericho, Ai, and Hazor.
So everywhere else, they just moved in.
Exactly. Deuteronomy 6 explicitly tells the Israelites they would inherit great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of all good things which you did not fill.
So we shouldn't be looking for a thick layer of ash across all of Canaan. We should be looking for a change in occupation.
Yes. And do they find that in the 13th century? Yes, they do. Archaeologists find clear evidence of a gradual infiltration and settlement pattern in the hill country during the 13th and 12th centuries.
What kind of evidence?
They find shared material culture. The pottery styles, the farming tools, the 4-room pillared house layouts of these early Israelite settlements look very similar to Canaanite architecture.
And critics have used that against the text too, right?
Absolutely. For decades, secular critics pointed to this and said, see? They used the same pots. There was no conquest. The Israelites were just Canaanites who rebranded themselves.
But based on what we just discussed, that's entirely backwards.
Exactly. Scholars like Hoffmeyer argue that this shared material culture is exactly what you would expect to find from a gradual infiltration into existing infrastructure, accompanied by the heavy cultural assimilation that the Bible explicitly laments throughout the entire book of Judges. The dirt matches the text perfectly once you understand what the text is actually claiming.
That makes so much sense. We were looking for the wrong kind of evidence because we fundamentally misunderstood the ancient text's claims.
Right.
But what about the numbers? The Bible talks about hundreds of thousands of Israelite soldiers coming out of Egypt. I've read estimates that the text implies over 2 million Israelites total.
Yeah, that's a famous issue.
How does a population that massive survive in the Sinai Desert, let alone sneak into Canaan? It would be a demographic impossibility for the late Bronze Age.
That is the other major archaeological puzzle. The demographic carrying capacity of the Sinai Peninsula and the Levant simply could not support millions of people marching together.
Yeah.
But once again, a deep dive into ancient linguistics solves the problem. The issue hinges on the translation of a single Hebrew word.
Aleph.
Yes. When the King James translators were working in 1611 England, they didn't have the benefit of modern archaeological discoveries like the Ugaritic texts or Akkadian cuneiform to understand cognate languages. They saw the word Aleph. And knowing from later biblical Hebrew that it meant 1,000, they translated it uniformly as 1,000.
So it says things like 12,000 men went to battle.
Exactly. But modern linguists studying late Bronze Age Semitic languages realize that Aleph has a much broader semantic range.
Meaning it doesn't just mean 1,000.
Right. In ancient Near Eastern military contexts, it frequently meant a unit, a clan, or a squad, without specifying the exact numerical head count of that squad. It's similar to how we might say the president sent 2 battalions without specifying if those battalions are at full strength.
Oh, wow. So when the text says 12 Aleph attacked a fort,
It doesn't mean 12,000 individual men. It likely means 12 military units or squads attacked the fort.
and a squad could be.
A squad could be 10 men or 20 men. When you translate Aleph as unit or squad in these military census lists, the demographic numbers of the Exodus and the conquest drop dramatically. Instead of millions, you are looking at a total population of maybe 25,000 to 100,000 people.
Which completely solves the demographic problem. An army of a few thousand men perfectly aligns with the documented population carrying capacity of the region, the size of the small citadel forts they were attacking, and the gradual nature of the campaign.
It brings the entire narrative out of the realm of demographic myth and plants it firmly into the historical reality of late Bronze Age tribal warfare.
Okay, this has been an incredible deconstruction of the ancient history, but we have to bring this into the modern era. Because a lingering question remains, and it is arguably the most important one for people living today.
What's that?
Even if we accept all of this, that it was limited, citadel-focused warfare against corrupt regimes using hyperbolic language, the fact remains that a text exists claiming God commanded warfare. Doesn't this validate religious violence today?
That is the big concern.
Right. Can a modern extremist just point to the book of Joshua and say, God told Joshua to do it, and God is telling me to do it too?
That is the ultimate existential fear behind the genocide charge. It's what drives the passion of critics like Hitchens. But the textual and historical analysis of the scholars closes the door firmly on modern holy war.
Oh.
First, we have to look at the internal history of national Israel itself. They never, ever extended this warfare paradigm to other nations.
Right. Earlier you mentioned King David. He conquered massive amounts of territory, but he didn't wipe people out.
Exactly. When David conquered surrounding peoples like the Philistines or the Arameans, he didn't apply the ban, the harem. He subjugated them and taxed them like a normal ancient monarch.
So it was a one-time thing.
Yes. The biblical prophets never called for a renewed Canaanite campaign against Assyria, Babylon, or Rome. The command was geographically and temporally locked to that specific salvation historical moment in Canaan. It was a one-time event required to establish sacred space, not a universal blueprint for foreign policy.
But beyond the Old Testament, the entire Christian framework completely shifts the paradigm when you get to the New Testament.
Completely and totally. The sources emphasize the explicit teaching of Jesus Christ, which repudiates religious violence.
Where does he do that?
When Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate, facing execution, Pilate asks him if he is a king. Jesus responds, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over."
He explicitly decouples his kingdom from physical military warfare.
Yes, and we see it in action in the Garden of Gethsemane. When the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, Peter pulls a sword and cuts off a man's ear. He thinks it's time for a Joshua-style holy war.
Right.
But Jesus rebukes him, heals the man, and tells Peter to put the sword away, saying, "All those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword."
So Jesus explicitly forbids holy war in his name.
Yes. The New Testament permanently closes the door on theocratic warfare. Any Christian who attempts to use the Joshua text to justify modern violence is, by the New Testament's own internal explicit standard, directly violating the foundational teachings of Christ.
But people have done it. That's the reality of history. What about the Crusades? Critics point to the Crusades as the ultimate proof that these texts are dangerous.
The sources address this by bringing in the work of Bernard Lewis, one of the most prominent historians of the Middle East. Lewis does a fascinating comparative analysis of the Christian Crusades and Islamic Jihad to highlight their structural differences within their respective traditions.
So what did he find?
He observes that the Crusades, while horrific, were essentially a historical aberration. They occurred late in Christian history, they lasted for a relatively brief period, and most importantly, they directly violated the explicit teachings of the New Testament's founder. Jesus never taught, commanded, or modeled military violence.
Right, so the Crusaders were acting against their own rule book. They had to ignore the Sermon on the Mount to march on Jerusalem.
Exactly. Lewis contrasts this with jihad in the early centuries of Islam, noting that it was present from the beginning, modeled by its founder in numerous military campaigns, and integrated into its foundational texts as a continuing obligation. The point the scholars are making here is not to litigate modern geopolitics, but to show that Christian misuse of the Joshua texts is identifiable as a misuse, precisely because the New Testament strictly and explicitly forbids it.
I hear that, but let me push back again, because we live in a world with a lot of bad actors. Can't anyone, anywhere, just stand up, ignore the text, and claim, God spoke to me in a dream and told me to do something terrible?
Sure, people can say anything.
How does a religious framework actually stop a bad actor?
It stops them by having built-in objective criteria to evaluate claims of divine revelation. In Orthodox Christianity, you can't just claim God spoke to you privately and expect obedience.
Yeah.
Any claim of a new divine command must be measured against the established trajectory of the biblical canon.
Right.
It must be accompanied by undeniable public, prophetic, and miraculous confirmation on the scale of the Exodus and the Red Sea. And above all, it must perfectly align with the revealed character of Jesus Christ, who is viewed as the exact, final representation of God's nature.
And since Jesus rejected violence,
Right. Since Jesus definitively rejected religious violence and explicitly commanded his followers to love their enemies, any modern claim that God is commanding religious violence is immediately structurally disqualified.
it's conceptually impossible within the theology itself. It would be like a modern American politician trying to use the Declaration of Independence to argue that we should establish a monarchy. The document itself intrinsically refutes the application.
Exactly. The theological safeguards against modern holy war are woven into the very fabric of the New Testament.
Okay, we are coming into the home stretch here, but we have to address the hardest, most uncomfortable pushback from the critics. And to their credit, Copan, Flanagan, and the other scholars do not shy away from this.
They tackle it head on.
Even if we accept everything we've discussed, even if the campaign was targeted at military citadels, even if it wasn't ethnic cleansing, even with the hyperbolic rhetoric in ancient warfare, collateral damage is a reality. What about the children? What about the infants who did die in these conflicts? Because no matter how small the fort was or how many civilians fled, some children inevitably died.
This is undoubtedly the most emotionally heavy and philosophically complex part of the entire discussion. The scholars do not sugarcoat this visceral reality.
Okay.
While children were clearly not the deliberate targets of the campaign, because the strategy was to drive out the civilian populations, inevitably, in the brutal reality of ancient military conflicts, some non-combatants, including children, would have lost their lives.
So how does the theology possibly justify that? Because this is where a modern secular listener is going to say, I don't care about your linguistic hyperbole, a dead child is a dead child.
The Christian theological answer relies on a framework of ultimate compensation and eternal justice. The classical view, defended by Copan and Flanagan, is that children who die before reaching the age of moral accountability are received directly by God into eternal life. They do not face judgment for sins they haven't committed.
Okay.
So while their physical earthly death is a genuine heartbreaking tragedy, they suffer no eternal harm. In fact, within the Christian metaphysical framework, they are rescued from growing up in a deeply corrupt, abusive Canaanite system, where they likely would have faced child sacrifice or exploitation anyway, and are brought into the eternal presence of God.
I have to be honest here. To a modern secular person, that answer feels incredibly convenient. It feels like a massive theological cop-out. It sounds like saying, well, they went to heaven, so it's fine that they were killed in a war.
The scholars acknowledge how jarring that sounds to a modern ear, but they point out a fascinating philosophical shift that happens at this exact moment in the debate.
What kind of shift?
If a critic is a strict naturalist, meaning they believe there is no God, no human soul, and absolutely no afterlife, then of course they reject this theology of compensation. To a naturalist, biological death is the final, absolute end of existence.
Right. So the death of a child is the ultimate, unmitigated tragedy because they are robbed of all future experiences.
Exactly. But if the critic is a naturalist, then the death of a Canaanite child in an ancient battle is tragic in the exact same way. A death from an earthquake, a tsunami, or childhood leukemia is tragic under naturalism. It's just matter in motion. The universe is blind and indifferent.
Oh, I see.
So the argument suddenly shifts. We are no longer specifically debating, did God command a genocide? We are debating the broader general problem of evil and suffering in the world. We are asking, why does a good God allow bad things to happen at all? Why do innocent people die in natural disasters?
Which is a massive, incredibly important philosophical question, but it's a completely different category of question than historical genocide.
It is a different category. And exploring the problem of evil raises an important counter-question about the alternatives. Critics often say, well, an all-powerful God shouldn't have used a war. He should have just converted the Canaanites painlessly. He should have just miraculously changed their minds.
Right, just snap his fingers and make everyone peaceful and moral.
But that objection assumes that divine coerced conversion is morally superior to human freedom. But forced love, or forced morality is a contradiction in terms. You cannot force a free sentient creature to love you or to choose moral goodness.
Because then they aren't free.
If God overrides human free will, humans are just robots. God gave the Canaanites centuries of patience. He provided the terrifying witness of the Exodus and the Red Sea as a warning, and he provided clear opportunities for individuals like Rahab to defect and be saved. He honored human agency, even when that agency was used to build a horrific, corrupt society that ultimately required dismantling.
So we've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, moving from linguistics to archaeology to metaphysics. Let me try to summarize where we've landed on this deep dive. We started with the explosive, modern charge championed by critics like Dawkins, that the God of the Old Testament commanded a bloodthirsty ethnic genocide. But when we actually dug into the historical and textual sources, that charge simply collapsed.
It did, under the weight of multiple converging lines of linguistic and archaeological evidence.
We looked at the legal definition of genocide, targeting a group based on their ethnicity as such, and saw that the Canaanites were targeted for their systemic, institutionalized moral corruption, not their genetics. We saw that explicit exceptions were made for anyone who repented and changed allegiance, like Rahab and the Gibeonites.
We examine the hyperbolic, exaggerated language of late Bronze Age warfare. By looking at the Egyptians and the Moabites, we realize that phrases like utterly destroyed were the ancient equivalent of sports trash talk, not a literal body count. This is confirmed by the internal, deliberate contradictions of the biblical text itself.
We looked at the Hebrew verbs yarish and garash, realizing the primary strategic goal was to drive out or dispossess, not to slaughter. We redefined our modern concept of a city, learning from the Amarna letters in archaeology that places like Jericho were actually tiny military citadels housing soldiers, not sprawling civilian metropolises.
We contextualized the entire campaign within the biblical theology of sacred space. We saw the terrifyingly objective standard of the boomerang effect and understood the unrepeatable, unique salvation historical mission to preserve the redemptive trajectory for all humanity.
And finally, we saw how the New Testament completely shifts the paradigm, with Jesus explicitly forbidding holy war, making any modern attempt to use these ancient texts to justify violence a direct violation of Christian teaching.
The cumulative case is incredibly strong. When you take the time to read an ancient text as an ancient text, rather than projecting a modern news report onto it, the moral landscape changes entirely.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought for you, our learner, to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. We just spent an hour realizing that applying our modern, literalistic 21st century journalistic standards to an ancient Bronze Age text completely distorted its actual meaning. It created a modern moral panic over a genocide that, historically and textually, wasn't actually described. It makes you wonder, what other ancient historical accounts, what other ancient myths or foundational documents of human history are we fundamentally misreading right now? How much of human history are we completely misunderstanding and getting needlessly angry about simply because we refuse to learn the literary language of the people who actually wrote it?
Yeah.
It's exactly like trying to read a poem using a math textbook. You're going to get an answer, but you're going to get the wrong one every single time. Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.